Let's talk to Jim. Him from Missouri wants to talk about the atheist burden of proof. Jim, you are live. What would you like to talk about?
Well, yes. When people say that atheists have a burden of proof, I always say that the burden of proof for atheists is the same burden of proof that a defense attorney has in an American criminal court. And it's simply just to show that there is reasonable doubt.
I would agree with that. I would phrase it slightly differently. I would say that if it's not really dependent on anything of the defense attorney. What it's depending on is whether or not the prosecutor makes their case. Now, their case can fail in a variety of different ways. Maybe the judge throws out some of their claims. Maybe they just have a bad argument, or one of the options is that the defense is able to poke holes in the claim. But when we're talking about a burden of proof, I think the word burden there is important, right? If you want to make a claim, you are shouldering that burden, you are adopting that burden. And so I prefer when talking about the burden of proof, I don't like to separate between atheist and theist, because an atheist can certainly say things that require proof, and a theist can say things that don't require a burden of proof. And so it's just that most of their theist claims do. But it's people that are making a positive assertion about something they're saying something is true. They're saying something is the case. To me, when somebody says that, then they are adopting the burden of proof. And so then the rest of us can just say, how do you know that? Well, how can you show that that's the case? And whether or not they're saying that there's a God, whether or not they're saying that there is no God, which is not something that I assert. I'm not that type of an atheist. I don't say that I know that there's no God, or I don't even say that I believe that there's no God. I'm saying that I haven't seen an argument from a theist that makes their case. And so that's not I suppose, if you want to be pedantic here, then that would in fact be a claim. And so then they say, you haven't seen an argument that makes the case, then prove that to me. And so then I can describe the types of arguments that I've heard, and I can point out the problems with those arguments as I see them. But if I'm not making a statement about reality, then I'm not shouldering that burden of proof. And that's really the bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I always say this, when it comes to theists and they want to say that, yes, there's a God, I say, okay, you have to show it beyond a reasonable doubt,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I want to push back a little bit too, because the courtroom example is great. However, I would say that like poking holes in the other argument you don't have the burden to do that. Like, as if we're thinking about the claim, guilty or not guilty, it's not the claim of guilty versus innocent. Like, the defense does not have to prove that the defendant is innocent. They just have to, their job is to kind of, like you were saying, show if there's any reasonable doubt, and show if the prosecution has met their burden or not. So I would say there isn't a burden on the defense. The burden is on the prosecution. And at the end of the day, they have to convince the jury that the person is guilty. And if they cannot do that, then they have not met their burden. But there's no burden on the defense to make a case that the person is innocent. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, and that's my point. Last night I was watching some of the miniseries of American Crime Story on O.J. Simpson. They didn't really prove that O.J. didn't do it. They just showed that basically Johnny Cochran's whole case was Mark Fuhrman's a racist. And that put into the mind of the jury maybe some doubts. Did he actually do it, or was he framed? Yeah, so all it did was say, could this person be convicted under this these specific charges that were brought against them? And something else too, like if somebody is charged with certain crimes, like they could be found not guilty because even if they did it, but if they didn't do the crime that was
that they're being charged with, they're not necessarily going to be convicted, and it's still not a situation where the defense has the burden there. So I agree with Scott that we need to be careful about the use of burden, because in this case there isn't an obligation to have to put up that case. So but otherwise, like I do agree with most of what you're saying. I know this particular point is a little bit pedantic, but
yeah, well, I mean, it's just my feelings. Again, I feel that, everybody, when any theist comes and says, well, you can't prove God doesn't exist, and that's their whole argument. It's like, yeah, I can't prove God doesn't exist any more than I can prove that, the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, the Abominable Snowman, Chupacabra, the lost cities of Atlantis, El Dorado, or Shangri-La don't exist. Does that mean they do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're getting into like a Russell's teapot argument here. And I think we're just framing that slightly differently. But yeah, we're on the same page, I think, with that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, again, how many defense attorneys win cases just by showing reasonable doubt? By saying,
right.
Hey,
yeah, that's the point there. So what they're by. I'm sorry, Jim. You finish, and then I'll say.
Oh yeah. Again, they don't completely say the guy didn't do it. They just said there is enough doubt to say maybe he's innocent.
Right. So they do that. They do that to show that the prosecution has failed to make their case. What they're doing when they're showing reasonable doubt, as you said, what they're doing is they're saying the prosecution has the obligation to make their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Here I see reasonable doubt. Therefore, the prosecution has failed to make their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And so the defense is not obligated to demonstrate reasonable doubt, but they can. That's one of the ways that they can show that the prosecution hasn't made their case. And it's different. Just because you're not obligated to prove your statement, you still have that option. It's just you haven't adopted that burden. You're not making a statement that requires that kind of support. You're not making a statement that the universe is a particular way. What you're saying is you have failed to make your case. And that's what we do. That's what we do here.
Mm-hmm. Well, sometimes when I'm debating theists, that's kind of what I say. You have not proven that your particular God, whichever God it is, exists beyond a reasonable doubt.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very possible that there is no God.
All right. Yeah. I think
and if they failed to make their case, then that's where you got to land.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anything else? I feel like we're in agreement here. Anything else you wanted to bring up before we go on to another call?
We stand in violent agreement.
We stand in agreement.
Mm-hmm. Oh, darn. We were in violent agreement. How about that? Hey, nothing really. No, but I kind of wanted to bring it out, to where I'm sure there are probably people in the queue who are probably saying, getting mad at me, but hey, it's the truth.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your call, Jim.
A reasonable doubt.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.